This podcast contains descriptions of violence against children and adult language and is not suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Hi everyone, Lane here. In episode 8, I covered the story of 16-month-old Alissa Guernsey, who died in 2009 while in the care of her mother's cousin, Christy Shaffer. Alissa's death was ruled a homicide caused by blunt force trauma. The police had only one suspect, Christy. However, Prosecutor Jeff Wible charged her with nothing more than neglect, and the judge let her out of jail after a mere 77 days. In the first segment of this episode, you'll hear episode 8 as it originally aired, in which I tell Alissa's tragic story. In the second segment, you'll hear episode 25, in which you'll hear the unprecedented telephone interview Jeff Wible granted me in August of 2020. This is a story in which small-town politics, corruption in the justice system, grassroots activism, and the utter miscarriage of justice intertwine. This is episode 127, Alissa Guernsey, the mega episode. Hi guys, and welcome to Suffer the Little Children, the true crime podcast giving voices back to the victims of child abuse and shining a harsh spotlight on the parents, guardians, and caretakers who silenced them. I'm your host, Lane, and this is episode 8, Alissa Guernsey. I first learned about Alissa's story years ago when it was in the news. She's had a special place in my heart for a very long time, but her story has always been too intensive, tragic, and daunting to tackle. Because April is Child Abuse Awareness Month, I finally buckled down and put together the most comprehensive account possible of the life and death of 16-month-old Alissa Guernsey, the criminal case that followed, and the aftermath of both. In 2009, Alissa died while living in the home of her mother's cousin, Christy Shaffer. Her injuries were horrifying, and her death was ruled a homicide caused by blunt force trauma. Her caretaker, Christy, was charged in her death, but when you hear what ultimately came of this case, I guarantee you're going to be as baffled, heartbroken, and furious as I am. Alissa only lived for 16 months, but her impact will be felt forever. My sources for today's episode were the South Bend Tribune, WTHR 13 Investigates, Inside Edition, Baby Alissa Cries for Justice Facebook page, Healthline, Lighting Their Way Home blog, Angel is Dee's Place, the Indianapolis Recorder, KPC News, Documenting Reality, Change.org, and Court Documents. Blonde, brown-eyed Alissa Beth Guernsey was born on November 2, 2007 in Columbia City, Indiana, to parents Kelly Sprunger and Michael Guernsey. By all reports, Alissa was her daddy's pride and joy. Her mommy, with whom Alissa shared a birthday, called Alissa her bitty pretty. Her uncle, Tyler Sprunger, said this about her.
Cute, smiley, big smile. She loved just to cuddle up and snuggle right up with you. She was just a little cutie.
Less than 3 weeks after Alissa's first birthday, her father, Michael, was killed in a one-car wreck on I-69 southbound. Alissa's mom, Kelly, was grief-stricken at the loss of her fiancé. With her history of depression and drug dependency on top of the tragedy, she didn't feel she was capable of caring properly for her 3 children, 6-year-old Lily, who was a double amputee, 3-year-old Noah, and 1-year-old Alissa. Kelly didn't want her babies in foster care. Thinking she was doing the right thing, Kelly agreed to let her cousin, 29-year-old Christy Shaffer, and her husband, 34-year-old Matt, care for Kelly's children while she attempted to recuperate. On December 8, 2008, Christy told DCS she would be happy to take in Kelly's children, but that she wished she knew how long she would have them. The kids were placed into her home in Topeka shortly thereafter, despite Kelly's mother, Beth, telling DCS on December 10th that she did not want her grandchildren in foster care either, and she was willing to take the kids. At Alyssa's first appointment with Topeka pediatrician Dr. John Egley on December 10, 2008, for a foster care physical, he determined that everything was within normal limits and that Alissa was a healthy, happy baby who was meeting her developmental milestones on time. Unfortunately, instead of getting back on her feet, Kelly descended deeper into drug use and neglected to keep in contact with her caseworkers. DCS wanted her to take a drug test, but she refused, leading to a citation for neglect after what DCS deemed amounted to abandoning her children. Lily, Noah, and Alissa were declared wards of the state of Indiana, and Matt and Christy Shaffer, who had no training as foster parents, were given temporary custody. They qualified as official foster parents not because they had any training, but because they were relatives of the kids, and because they had taken guardianship of Kelly's older two children in the past when Kelly was incarcerated. The three children added to the Shaffers' already large brood, which included, at the time, Matt's daughter, 12-year-old Haley, as well as the couple's three children, 9-year-old Braden, 7-year-old McKenna, and 3-year-old Ashlyn. At the time, the children were placed in the Shaffer home at 315 West Pine Street in Topeka. Both Christy and Matt were unemployed. Matt received a weekly unemployment payment of $360 and a child support payment for Haley every other week in the amount of $160. On December 15th, Christy missed her first scheduled court hearing, claiming she had a migraine and that two of the kids were sick. It should be noted that 6-year-old Lily received SSI benefits. On January 6, 2009, Christy filed a petition asking for Lily's SSI payments of $637 a month to be allocated to the Shaffers. DCS paid a visit to the children on January 12th, noting that they all appeared happy and healthy. Christy reported they were doing well. Before long, however, things took a dark turn. With both adults unemployed, finances were understandably tight, and with 7 kids in the house, tensions no doubt ran high. It seems Christy singled Alissa out among the many children living in her home as the scapegoat for her frustrations. During the 110 days Alissa spent in the Shaffer home, she went from a normal, healthy, bubbly little girl with a quick smile to a nervous, quiet, withdrawn child. Family members who were able to see her during this time thought she appeared pale and sickly and noticed bruises on the baby's face and head, but because the Shaffers, who were the kids' blood relatives, had taken Kelly's children in out of the supposed kindness of their hearts, no one suspected Alissa was being abused. On January 27, 2009, Alissa received one suture in Dr. Egley's office for a 2-centimeter laceration on the left side of her forehead, an injury she supposedly received from a fall. The suture was removed on February 2nd, and the doctor did not note any other issues at that time. On February 5th, Christy reported Alissa's fall and injury to DCS and asked them about claiming Kelly's children on her taxes. The DCS employee she spoke with described Christy as difficult to work with and said in the report, quote, "I think she is the type of person that needs all the information possible before agreeing to anything," end quote. On February 9th, Christy called DCS to let them know that because Alissa and Noah were sick, she did not want them to attend their scheduled visit with Kelly. This was the beginning of Christy's campaign to prevent Kelly from seeing Alissa, but not Lily and Noah. She always had an excuse about why Alissa was not present, claiming the baby was sick or sleeping. DCS paid the children another visit on February 10th and observed that all of the kids appeared happy and healthy, even though Christy had reported 2 of them sick the previous day. Christy told DCS the kids had a doctor appointment later on in the day, although there's no record of the supposed visit at Dr. Egley's office. Likely to avoid being accused of abusing the baby, Christy began taking Alissa to doctors and specialists, claiming Alissa's hair was falling out and that she bruised easily. Alissa was seen on February 13th in Dr. Egley's office, where the doctor noted the baby had a rash, scabs, and hair loss, as well as bruises all over her face. According to Dr. Egley's records, he suspected an infection was to blame. Blood was drawn for labs, including a complete blood count with differential, a comprehensive metabolic panel, and a test for thyroid-stimulating hormone to test for any pathology. In the few months Alissa and her siblings lived with the Shaffers, the baby was seen by doctors at least 15 times. Christy tried to pass off Alissa's medical issues on fetal alcohol syndrome and lack of prenatal care, even alleging Alissa was born addicted to meth and crack, although medical records and tox screen reports taken when Alissa was born showed she was perfectly healthy and normal. Christy claimed Alissa was clumsy and difficult to deal with. She also claimed she and Matt had child-proofed their home, put up baby gates to protect Alissa from hurting herself, and even considered getting Alissa a helmet. Despite several rounds of blood tests, including testing for leukemia, none of the physicians consulted found anything medically wrong with Alissa. DCS was notified of Alissa's so-called medical problems. Christy reported to them on February 18th that because of the baby's issues, the doctor had suggested it would be best for Alissa to stay home. The same day, DCS notified Kelly about what had been going on with her younger daughter. Kelly told DCS that she was extremely concerned about Alissa, but it seems nothing was done to ensure the well-being of Kelly's children. Dr. Egley saw Alissa on February 24th for a cough and congestion. The doctor's notes stated, quote, "Physical exam reveals that she is doing well," end quote. Blood was once again drawn. The chart also states, quote, "Parents want her re-examined to make sure that she is all cleared of infection before she gets a repeat CBCD," end quote. The next day, Alissa was back in Dr. Egley's office, this time experiencing vomiting, diarrhea, and fever, and appearing flushed. The notes state that Christy and Matt were reassured. More blood was drawn on February 26th. Also on February 26th, Samuel Cruz, Lily and Noah's father, reported to DCS that he wanted to speak to his children, but that whenever he called Christy's home, she didn't answer and hadn't returned his calls. Dr. Egley saw Alissa yet again on March 3rd after she sustained an injury to her left arm. The doctor's notes for this visit indicate he was told that Alissa had just finished breakfast when she was placed on the floor to play. At that time, Matt arrived home with a family member's dogs after picking them up at the veterinary office. The dogs were excited and bowled Alissa over. Alissa immediately began crying, and it was reported that her left arm was hanging and that she wouldn't use the arm. The doctor's notes also indicate that Alissa once again had bruising on the left side of her face near her eye, and the doctor noted dandruff and hair loss again. X-rays were taken of her arm during this visit. An appointment was made for Alissa to see Dr. Robert Fallon, a specialist in hematology and oncology at Riley Hospital for Children in Indianapolis. At this point, Dr. Egley contacted Steuben County DCS to report the bruises on Alissa's face, but he told them that he did not suspect abuse, and that as he sat with her, another bruise had appeared on her face. As a mandatory reporter, he had fulfilled his obligation to notify DCS, but he downplayed the possibility that it was abuse, which meant they probably wouldn't investigate. On March 4th, a CT scan was performed on Alissa's left arm at Parkview LaGrange Hospital. On March 5th, Alissa was seen by Dr. Fallon at Riley. Unable to find a medical reason for Alissa's bruising and hair loss, the doctor came to the conclusion that the baby must be banging her head against her crib in her sleep. I've never heard of a 1-year-old causing constant and repeated injuries to herself by flailing wildly in her sleep. It's beyond comprehension to me that at this point no one suspected this little girl was being physically abused. On March 11th, Dr. Egley once again saw Alissa, whose left hand was now swollen, and she was still unable to use her left arm, which had been injured 8 days before. When an MRI was finally performed on Alissa's arm on March 19th, it revealed a Salter-Harris fracture type 1, which is an injury to the growth plate area of a child's bone. The growth plate is an area of cartilage at the ends of long bones where most of a child's bone growth occurs. When children become fully grown, the cartilage hardens into bone. It is important to treat these types of fractures as soon as possible to avoid impeding normal bone growth. When he received the results of the MRI, Dr. Egley was informed that this type of injury is concerning for inflicted trauma, but he still did not report these findings to DCS. On March 24th, Christy requested a prescription for Alissa's pain, claiming that Tylenol and Motrin weren't strong enough. Dr. Egley prescribed 20 milligrams of hydrocodone, more commonly known as Vicodin, which he said should last Alissa more than 3 days, even if she was given the maximum dose every 4 hours. Funny that, because on March 26th, Christy called the doctor for more hydrocodone, saying they were nearly out already. Dr. Egley prescribed more, though it's not documented how much he ordered at that time. According to what Christy later told investigators, Alissa's cast slid off her arm on the morning of March 27th. The final incident took place on the evening of March 28, 2009, when Christy packed up Alissa and some of the other children at about 6:45 p.m. to take a trip to a nearby town to pick up Happy Meals at McDonald's and rent a movie at the video store. Alissa was strapped into her car seat behind Christy. During that trip, Christy reportedly became enraged at the 1-year-old baby and began beating her, gripping the screaming toddler's hair and smashing her little head over and over again against the car seat. Alissa soon lost consciousness. Kelly later reported that Lily was sitting next to Alissa when her fatal injuries were administered. According to Kelly, Christy, crying, stopped the car several times on the way back to Topeka to check on Alissa, which Christy told investigators she had not done. Christy told Lily to lift Alissa's head, but the baby's head kept flopping forward. Lily asked Christy, "What's wrong with Alissa?" Kelly said Christy's response was to yell, "Stop asking that." Christy later told investigators she heard Alissa making snoring or grunting noises from the back seat shortly before they arrived home. When they returned home at about 8:20 p.m., Christy took the other children inside the house to get them situated before she returned for Alissa's limp body, telling police she had not noticed Alissa's condition until she brought the baby inside. Christy's brother Nate was an EMT, so this supposedly innocent woman called him instead of dialing 911. Nate, who lived close by, rushed to the Shaffer home and noticed that Alissa, who was already cold to the touch, was unresponsive with no pulse. Finally, at 8:25 p.m., they called 911, and Nate performed CPR on Alissa until first responders arrived at 8:40 p.m. and took over. At 8:52 p.m., Alissa was taken to Parkview LaGrange Hospital, arriving at 9:07 p.m. The medical team worked their asses off for the next 47 minutes to try to save the baby's life, even administering Narcan in case Alissa's condition had been caused by an accidental opiate overdose, because Christy had reported giving Alissa a 3-milliliter dose of hydrocodone before putting her down for a nap at 2 p.m. Despite the heroic efforts of the hospital staff, Alissa was beyond help, and eventually their life-saving efforts had to cease. Alissa Beth Guernsey, not even a week shy of 17 months old, was pronounced dead at 9:54 p.m. The Shaffers notified DCS's Family Case Matters Division at 10:10 p.m. that Alissa had died. At 1:20 a.m. on March 29th, Alissa's tiny, battered body was transported to St. Joseph Forensic Center in Fort Wayne, where at 8:30 a.m. on March 30th, an autopsy was conducted by Dr. Scott A. Wagner on the orders of LaGrange County Coroner Bruce Coney. If you want to view the autopsy photos, they're available as a slideshow within my article on sufferthelittlechildrenblog.com about Alissa, posted on April 11th, 2020. The photos are hidden beneath a warning image in the slideshow. They are absolutely horrific. You cannot imagine how awful these photos are, but I think it's important that they're out there and that people see them so they understand what this baby actually went through, especially considering how the criminal case turned out. But we will get to that. The autopsy revealed several horrendous injuries, including bruises on the top of Alissa's head, both on the scalp and in the tissue between the scalp and the skull. There were multiple bruises on the baby's face and a fresh contusion on her left thigh. Alissa was missing patches of hair, which was determined to have been torn out rather than falling out on its own. The pathologist found Alissa had suffered bilateral subdermal hematoma, which is blood collecting between the brain and the skull on both sides of her head. Alissa had 2 gruesome lacerations inside her mouth in the areas where her gums met the inside of her lips, one fresh, one in the beginning stages of healing. She also had a broken left elbow and a growth plate displacement, as well as internal injuries. The toxicology report revealed only Naxalone or Narcan in Alissa's blood, so Christy's story about giving the baby even a single dose of her prescribed hydrocodone was bullshit. Where did the hydrocodone, which is an opiate, go? Many people believe that Christy herself used it, although she later denied this. During a deposition, Christy was asked about Alissa's injuries.
Is there anything you explain to me how the child got all these bruises on his face?
Watch him.
Smack the child, beat the child?
No, never.
Coroner Bruce Coney brought in Dr. Antoinette Lasky, an independent expert from the Indiana University School of Medicine Children's Health Services Research Department, who reviewed the autopsy and medical history reports and determined that Alissa's bruises were most consistent with inflicted trauma and child abuse. Regarding her hair loss, the expert opined that it was highly concerning for someone pulling out Alissa's hair. The report also stated that the baby's arm fracture was not consistent with the family's story of Alissa being bowled over by the dog, rather appearing to be, again, inflicted trauma. That means someone caused this baby's injuries on purpose. The cause of death was ruled to be blunt force trauma of the head, and the manner was determined to be homicide. The Sheriff's Department described Alissa's injuries as obvious signs of abuse. A report by the Indiana Department of Child Services stated that the fatal blow to Alissa was, quote, that of an adult punching a child in the mouth as hard as they could, end quote. So one would expect murder charges to be filed, right? Nothing about this case meets any kind of expectations. Rather than deciding himself if charges should be filed like most prosecutors would, LaGrange County Prosecutor Jeff Wible, for the first time in his 10 years as a prosecutor, convened a grand jury in the case and let them come to a conclusion about whether or not to charge Christy Shaffer.
It was a very controversial case. It wasn't clear to me what the best charge would be. So I thought a grand jury would be the best remedy for that dilemma.
He said he didn't have a witness. Several children witnessed Alissa's fatal beating. The grand jury indicted Christy on a charge of neglect of a dependent, a Class B felony, neglect resulting in serious injury. No murder, no manslaughter, no abuse, not even neglect resulting in death. Joel Schum, a professor at the Indiana University Robert H. McKinney School of Law, spoke to a reporter.
You would expect the prosecutor to look at the evidence and to make a decision based on the evidence the prosecutor had.
Grand juries, according to Professor Schum, are not usually called in Indiana unless the case is politically sensitive, and not usually for cases in which the prosecutor is unsure of which charges to file.
A grand jury process is very secretive, so there's not transparency. We don't know what they were told or what they weren't told or anything else that happened in that process.
That includes what evidence was presented to the grand jury, which is why it is impossible to determine why Christy was not indicted on murder or even manslaughter charges, let alone while she was indicted on the neglect of a dependent as a mere Class B felony, neglect resulting in serious injury, as opposed to Class A, which indicates neglect resulting in death. Professor Schum said, quote, I can certainly see no reason why it would be charged this way. In this case, there's no question that there's a death, and if there's neglect and death, you'd expect it to be charged as an A felony, end quote. Class A felonies in Indiana can incur a sentence of 20 to 50 years in prison, while Class B felonies can only bring a sentence of 6 years to 20 years. Well, in that case, Christy made out like a bandit. She accepted a plea bargain, pleading guilty to her piddly little neglect charge, all the while having the gall to deny she caused Alissa's injuries by submitting an affidavit to the court that read in part, although I acknowledge the opinion of an expert witness who determined that Alissa Guernsey died as the result of blunt force trauma, I disagree with the expert's opinion. Even though I am not personally responsible for, nor did I participate in, causing any injuries to Alissa Guernsey, I realize that I am legally responsible for providing timely medical treatment while she was in my care and custody. To add insult to injury, along with Christy's guilty plea, her husband Matthew Shaffer was granted immunity. If they were truly innocent, what did he need immunity from? Christy's plea was accepted by LaGrange County Circuit Court Judge J. Scott Vanderbeck, who, it would later be revealed, had a personal relationship with Christy's family and a pretty massive man-crush on her father. Christy's plea could have landed her in prison for up to 20 years, but she had no criminal history, and dozens of friends and members of her family, including her father and her own children, had written 101 pages of letters to the court, begging the judge to have mercy on her. Some of the same family and friends attended her sentencing hearing on May 25, 2011, making tearful statements for Judge Vanderbeck to be lenient on her. Only 7 pages of letters pleading for justice were sent to the court from the other side of the family. Christy's defense had hired a forensic psychologist who testified at the hearing that in-depth testing performed on Christy showed she displayed a low potential for child abuse compared to people who had been convicted of physically abusing children. Christy's defense attorney called Kelly to the stand during Christy's sentencing hearing and grilled Kelly about her own history of drug use, all but shouting from the rooftops that Kelly bore the responsibility for Alissa's death. During the hearing, according to the transcript, Judge Vanderbeck was debating with a DCS investigator and Christy's attorney about the level of danger Christy posed to her children. He eventually decided to place Christy's 4 children with her father, Kerry Sprunger. Regarding this decision, the judge said, "I'm not tipping my hand and suggesting that I know what I'm doing yet as to the ultimate resolution. I'm just, you don't get faced with stuff like this, and these people are being nice, and if you take their side and something tragic would happen with a child and a ticking time bomb, that doesn't make them bad. It kind of just makes them at the wrong place at the wrong time." Trying to read that statement now makes me wonder if I'm having a stroke, or if the judge was when he said it. The real takeaways for me are ticking time bomb. Was he referring to Alissa, Christy, or what? And wrong place at the wrong time, which is definitely not how I would describe a sustained pattern of child abuse leading to a baby's brutal murder. Christy herself begged the judge for leniency, telling him the same old bullshit about unexplained bruising, clumsiness, blah, blah, blah. She cried on the stand as she described the many doctor visits Alissa endured as they tried to diagnose her with some medical ailment that would explain the injuries. Christy told Judge Vanderbeck, "Alissa may not have been my biological child, but she was my baby while she lived with us. I lost a child that night too, and a piece of my heart. Your Honor, I beg of you, please not take me away from my children. They are my whole world, and they need me as much as I need them." Judge Vanderbeck swallowed this hook, line, and sinker. Before handing down Christy's sentence, he took the opportunity to throw a completely unwarranted jab at Kelly, telling the courtroom that she shoulders the responsibility for Alissa's death. Then Judge Vanderbeck proceeded to sentence Christy to 10 years in prison, with 6 years suspended. Indiana's Good Time Credit Program ensured that the remaining 4 years would automatically be cut in half. Judge Vanderbeck told Christy's attorney to come back after Christy underwent testing at the Department of Correction Diagnostics Center, and he would, quote, entertain a motion for her early release, end quote. Professor Schum weighed in on this, too.
Very rarely does a judge encourage a defense lawyer to file a motion and ask for a modification. So that's certainly surprising.
Well, Christy and her lawyer did return to court on August 11th, 2011, and guess what happened? Not only did Judge Vanderbeck consider reducing Christy's sentence, he released her right then and there, ordering her to serve 6 months of home detention and 3 years of probation. Christy's total time spent behind bars? 77 days. In his order, Judge Vanderbeck actually wrote, "There's nothing that can be done to bring back the life of the dependent child victim." Alissa's mom, Kelly, spoke with Inside Edition.
I think she got away with torture. She looked so bad. She was so skinny. She didn't barely have any hair.
Even Prosecutor Jeff Wible said he disagreed with the judge's decision.
I was against the modification. I did not think it was warranted. 77 days wasn't enough.
Every single person who followed the case and possessed a working brain agreed, including Kelly's brother, Tyler Sprunger, who felt from the beginning that his cousin should have been charged with more than neglect in connection with his niece's death.
There's not a day that doesn't go by where Alissa doesn't pop in my head, how she was basically, in my opinion, tortured to death. The autopsy specifically says homicide due to blunt force trauma to the head. The little girl was covered in bruises. Her hair, it was ripped out of her head. That comes from killing a child.
Tyler also told the reporter, quote, "I love Christy, but what she did was wrong," end quote. He also said about Alissa, quote, "She died a painful death. Blunt force trauma to the head, that's a lot of painful blows. It's not fair for a 15-month-old baby to go out like that. The defendant in this case was never tried for murder, was basically given a slap on the wrist. I don't know how she's not doing life, I really don't," end quote. Tyler created a Facebook page called 77 Days for Murder and organized protests outside the LaGrange County Courthouse to bring awareness to the absolute travesty of justice that was Alissa's case. At the rallies he organized, dozens of people marched, holding signs to let the court and the public at large know about their outrage over Judge Vanderbeck's decision.
I feel it's small-town politics at its best. Somebody knew somebody that knew somebody that, had been involved in the community. The links and the connections are there.
What did he mean by that? Remember how I mentioned earlier that Judge Vanderbeck had a personal relationship with Christy's family? This is Jeff Wible speaking to a reporter.
I know Christy Shaffer's father. He's a banker here in town, and I've spoken with him on occasion, but he's never been a client of mine, and I've never done any work for him.
Both Vanderbeck and Jeff Wible have admitted they know Christy's father, Kerry Sprunger, who as recently as 2018 was the chief loan officer and executive vice president of Farmers State Bank, one of the largest banks in LaGrange County. He's now listed as a member of their board of directors. Kerry has long been a prominent business leader in the area. According to a court transcript, Judge Vanderbeck said, "I know Mr. Sprunger. He's been on some boards with me. I know he's got a good heart, and I think I went to a baseball game with his son, so I wouldn't do that if they were bad people." Judge Vanderbeck has denied any conflict of interest and has repeatedly told the media that he cannot discuss his relationship with Christy's family or anything else regarding the case.
"I don't want to talk to you now. Judicial rules of conduct did not allow me to give a statement at this time."
Jeff Wible also denied there was any conflict of interest in the case. Inside Edition's Lisa Guerrero caught up with Wible outside his office.
My position was the judge should not have given her that little time.
Many people think that Christy Shaffer got away with murder. What is your response?
She didn't get away with murder.
Oh, and while I'm discussing possible conflicts of interest, it would be remiss of me not to mention that Prosecutor Jeff Wible spent many years sitting on the board of directors of the LaGrange County Community Foundation with none other than Dr. John Egley, Alyssa's pediatrician. Kerry Sprunger was a regular member of the foundation, donating undisclosed amounts of money and other assets. Professor Schum said that based on the facts he had reviewed in the case, it was unlikely that Judge Vanderbeck did anything to violate Indiana's Code of Judicial Conduct, but that judges are generally expected to recuse themselves from cases where a conflict of interest may be perceived. In Alyssa's case, almost everyone involved certainly perceived a conflict of interest, from Alyssa's family down to some of the investigators. He said, quote, "I know some judges would have stepped back because of the perception issue. I think it's imperative the process be seen as fair and the people involved in the process seen as impartial," end quote.
The process is, from the beginning to the end, a very unusual case.
Another law professor from Indiana University, Charles Gay, who specializes in legal ethics, said that based on the transcripts from the 2011 hearing, in his opinion, there were grounds for Judge Vanderbeck to disqualify himself from the case due to his relationship to the family. Quote, "He's made it clear he thinks the world of the father, who's obviously got an interest in this case through his daughter. The applicable standard for disqualification is whether a reasonable person fully informed of the facts would doubt the judge's impartiality. This judge does not sound as though he is saying that standard was met. Rather, he seems to be implying that the concerns are misguided," end quote. On August 17, 2011, 6 days after ordering Christy's release, and not long after the story gained national attention thanks to media coverage, Judge Vanderbeck finally signed an order of recusal and appointment of special judge, removing himself from the case and any future proceedings related to it, including lawsuits Kelly had filed in the matter. The order read in part, "In this case, an inflamed atmosphere has been created by people unconnected to this case. When a judge in a community plagued with methamphetamine use attempts to resolve a dispute involving drug use, family problems, the tragic death of an infant, and conflicting accounts of who's to blame, the rule of law provides guidance for justice. When an inflamed atmosphere follows based on a fictional account of circumstantial evidence that places unsupported blame on the innocent and the judge, not the facts that were presented at hearing, becomes the central focus, it is a sad day for justice in America." In his order, he also listed possible intimidating behavior by members of the public among his reasons for recusing himself. Citing state law, Vanderbeck named his own replacement, appointing DeKalb Superior Court Judge Kevin P. Wallace as special judge for future proceedings in the case. Even though in his recusal order the judge made reference to conflicting accounts of who's to blame for Alyssa's death, Indiana State Police Detective Jeff Boyd said unequivocally that Christy Shaffer was the investigator's one and only suspect. Bernadine Bucafori, the leader of the Baby Alissa Cries for Justice Facebook page and a member of the Alyssa's Army movement, spoke with Inside Edition.
This was a little baby. I mean, it's just incomprehensible.
She deserves justice. We're going to fight for her until she gets her justice. We're not stopping.
Justice for Alyssa! Justice for Alyssa!
Alyssa's uncle Tyler, who considers what happened to his niece a travesty of justice, said,
"Somebody has to stick up for her because nobody did. You cannot take a life and not have to pay for it."
Several petitions have been created on change.org over the years regarding Alyssa's case. The Baby Alissa Cries for Justice team started one such petition in 2012, asking first Indiana's Attorney General and, subsequently, then Indiana Governor Mike Pence, now the Vice President of the United States, to open a state murder investigation of Alissa's fatal beating death. The petition ultimately closed with 72,374 signatures, but the investigation was never opened. The U.S. Attorney General's office acknowledged that they received several petitions on the matter, but says the petitions were being directed to the wrong agency. AG Public Information Officer Brian Corbin told 13 Investigates, quote, "This doesn't fall under the Attorney General's jurisdiction. The Attorney General's office doesn't get to decide whether to reopen a case, and we don't affect outcomes on the trial court level. Concerned citizens should contact the LaGrange County Prosecutor's Office because the prosecutor has the sole authority to decide whether to reopen a case," end quote. That brings us right back around to Mr. Jeff Wible, who told the news station he sees no reason to reopen Alissa's case. Quote, "I haven't seen evidence to support anything other than what the grand jury indicted her with. If someone has evidence I'm not aware of, tell them to bring it forward," end quote. I wonder if he has seen the autopsy photos himself. A reporter from Fox 55 News contacted Wible and said the prosecutor responded that he will not reopen Alissa's case, quote, "because no one in Indiana cares about it," end quote. Wible says he never made such a comment and that he was just playing phone tag with the reporter. He did, however, tell a reporter for the Tribune that of all the letters he received regarding Alissa's case, none came from Indiana. Professor Schum said that even if new evidence was presented, it would be unlikely for Christy to be hit with further charges. Quote, "The state can't go after someone twice. Once the state signed a plea agreement with her, that pretty much put the issue to rest," end quote. Tyler posted on the 77 Days for Murder Facebook page in May of 2012, quote, "To all of Alissa's supporters, I have recently learned that the way Christy Shaffer's plea deal was drawn up, that there is no way possible to ever get her charged with murder or any other greater charge. Although it truly crushes me to admit that justice will never be served to my niece, it also brings me a lot of joy knowing how much she was loved, and to know there are so many good people left in the world. No matter how many signatures we get, no matter how much we protest, there is simply nothing that can be done to her. I want to thank you all so very much for your love and support. Maybe this story has touched some, and at least for future events, it can help some other innocent child get justice. Again, thank you all so very much and God bless." End quote. Tyler has since taken down the Facebook page. 13 Investigates dropped in at the Shaffer house. Matt answered the door and told the reporter it had been a horrible time for the family. Christy refused to talk at the time, and the Shaffers didn't respond to a request for an interview. Kerry Sprunger, Christy's father, also refused to speak with the news station. Kerry has also told inquiring reporters that the case has nothing to do with him. Kelly Sprunger, Alissa's mother, sued the Indiana Department of Child Services, Steuben County, and Ashley Westgate, the DCS caseworker assigned to Alissa's case, for their role in the baby's death, saying Westgate and DCS did not pay enough attention to the frequency of Alissa's injuries. The lawsuit sought damages for an unspecified dollar amount that would make Kelly and her family whole. In October of 2012, DCS agreed to a mediated settlement of $150,000. The settlement did not assign fault to DCS, and the agency stressed that the settlement amount did not reflect the value of Alissa's life. Ashley Westgate no longer works for DCS. Kelly's attorney, Kevin Likes, told the Tribune that he considers a $150,000 mediated settlement with a government agency a victory. Kelly told the reporter that she planned to use the money for surgery for her disabled daughter. The Baby Alissa Cries for Justice Facebook page reported that with the settlement money, Kelly said she bought a car and gave the rest of the money away. In November of 2013, while on probation for the neglect charge, 35-year-old Christy Shaffer was arrested and charged with possession of methamphetamine and maintaining a common nuisance, which are both Class D felonies. A probation officer had evidently received a tip that Christy was taking part in a meth operation, the takedown of which started when 2 LaGrange County men were arrested earlier that month and charged with higher-level felonies related to dealing and possessing meth. The 2 men were evidently making the drug in the garage of Christy's home. Police were searching the home of one of the men when Christy first texted and then called the man's cell phone. John Parrish, an investigator for the prosecutor's office, answered that phone call. Christy later admitted to flushing the meth and tutors, or straws, used to inhale smoke, down the toilet after the call. She also admitted to possessing meth. Only after this arrest were Christy's children removed from her home. It boggles my mind that she still had custody of her kids in the first place after her second cousin died in her care. For anyone unaware, meth production is insanely dangerous. The byproducts of meth labs contaminate the surroundings with highly explosive chemicals and toxic fumes. Meth labs are essentially time bombs. A single spark from any source can ignite the lingering chemicals and cause fires or even explosions. People die in meth lab fires all the time. Even possessing meth in a home with children is, to say the least, a bad parenting decision. Meth is a drug that stimulates the central nervous system and causes a huge amount of neurotoxins to flood the brain. Meth kills brain cells and can lead to psychosis or even fatal strokes, not to mention respiratory problems, heart problems, tooth decay, skin lesions, even death. The drug charges were a violation of Christy's existing probation, an offense to which she pled guilty in March of 2014. Judge Wallace sentenced Christy to serve the previously suspended 6 years of her original sentence on her charge of neglect in Alyssa's death. He recommended she be incarcerated in a facility specializing in substance abuse counseling. How unbearably sad that Christy would spend more time in prison for drugs than for the death of her 16-month-old second cousin. But kudos to Judge Wallace for making her pay to the best of his abilities. In the meth case, Christy received another plea deal, pleading guilty to one of the felony drug charges. Her public defender offered Judge Wallace information on an inpatient drug rehabilitation program as an alternative to prison time. Judge Wallace disregarded that and sentenced Christy to an additional 180 days in prison, which he specified would be served after her sentence for probation violation. In January of 2014, Kelly Sprunger filed a lawsuit against Dr. John Egley, accusing him of ignoring the standard of care by not reporting the abuse that led to Alyssa's death. Documents filed in the suit showed that Dr. Egley notified DCF officials of Alyssa's medical issues, but downplayed the possibility of abuse. The court ultimately ruled in favor of Dr. Egley, concluding that, quote, Indiana does not recognize a private right of action for failure to report child abuse, end quote. In the 2014 Indiana judicial elections, Judge Vanderbeck ran for re-election to the LaGrange County Circuit Court. He competed in the Republican primary on May 6, 2014 against R. Larry Helmer and received 58.9% of the vote. In the general election on November 4, 2014, he was unopposed. Judge Vanderbeck retired from the bench on June 1, 2018. Also in 2014, LaGrange County Prosecutor Jeff Wible was upset in the Republican primary election by Tim Kaine. In the general election later that year, independent candidate Greg Kenner was elected as the new LaGrange County Prosecutor. On October 18, 2015, Kelly and Alyssa's estate were awarded a joint and severable damage judgment against Christy and Matt Shaffer in the amount of $1 million. The court record reads, quote, However, the plaintiffs are precluded from enforcing the judgment as it pertains to Matthew Shaffer for the reason that said judgment has been discharged by the decision and order from the U.S. Bankruptcy Court, end quote. It is doubtful that Kelly will ever see a red cent from Christy. In December of 2015, Christy requested the court release her into a community corrections program after she completed several prison programs, including rehabilitation, and due to good behavior. Judge Kevin Wallace, who is the superhero of this story, denied her request and ruled that she would serve out the entirety of her term in the Indiana Department of Correction. Now there's the judge Alyssa deserved in the first place. Christy was paroled from the Rockville Correctional Facility in March of 2016 and has walked free ever since. In June of 2016, Matt and Christy Shaffer divorced. Matt was given sole custody of the couple's 3 children. Alyssa's siblings, Lily and Noah, were sent to live with their biological father in Mexico. Alissa Beth Guernsey is buried at Bronson Cemetery in Missouri. Her grave backs up to the headstone, marking the place where her father, Michael L. Guernsey, and her grandfather, John R. Guernsey, are buried. Sadly, Alyssa's own grave has no headstone. For several years, a small silver plate was the only marker for her final resting place, although supporters often left toys, flowers, balloons, and other tokens of their love for the little girl to decorate her gravesite. Alyssa's army reached out to her grandmother, who owns the cemetery plot where Alyssa is buried, and asked if they could pay for a headstone in tribute to Alyssa, but their request was refused. Alyssa's grandmother told them that the headstone was a family matter and something they would eventually take care of themselves. Undeterred, the Baby Alissa Cries for Justice group collected money for a memorial bench to be placed on a plot they purchased adjacent to Alyssa's. The bench was completed in October of 2016 and dedicated in March of 2017. They've asked the local police department to keep a special eye on the monument to avoid vandalism by those who may not agree with its placement. The front of the monument reads, "In loving memory, Alissa B. Guernsey, November 2, 2007 to March 28, 2009. There's an image of a dragonfly, under which it reads, "Since you'll never be forgotten, we pledge to you today, a hallowed place within our hearts is where you will always stay." The back reads, "Peacefully sleeping, resting at last, her weary trials and troubles past. In silence she suffered, in patience she bore, till God called her home to suffer no more. On a dragonfly's wings her soul set free, joyous and playful she will always be. No more sadness, no more pain. Fly high, little one, till we meet again. Forever our baby dragonfly." Jeff Wible is currently running for Senate. A Facebook group, Say No to Jeff Wible for elected seat, State Senate District 13, is dedicated to preventing this from happening. In addition, former law enforcement officer Marshall D. Talbert wrote a scathing letter to the editor of KPC News with the subject line, "We can campaign for a candidate or against them." To the editor, "Jeff Wible for Indiana Senate District 13? You've got to be kidding me. I wouldn't vote Jeff Wible for dog catcher if that were an elected office. When researching Wible's qualifications, simply do a Google search on the name Alissa Guernsey. Take a good look at the autopsy photographs of baby Alissa. The photographs do not depict neglect of a dependent. They depict a homicide, a murder. Her injuries, seen and unseen, are not the result of being clumsy or being knocked down by the family dog. Her injuries were inflicted. They are the result of a beating. Wible chose not to charge Christy Shaffer with killing the child. He convened a grand jury, and one has to wonder exactly what they were told. The lesser charge, neglect with bodily injury, certainly did not fit the crime. I was an Indiana state trooper for 25 years and the Howard County Sheriff for 8 years. I have never seen a greater miscarriage of justice than the Alissa Guernsey case. The great thing about living free in America is that we can campaign for a candidate or against them. The more than 100,000 members of Alyssa's army will do their part to prevent Wible's election to another public office that requires public trust and integrity. The Army will be back in LaGrange County. We have a constitutional right to congregate, protest, and express our continued displeasure with candidate Jeff Wible. We have a right to attend candidate debates and public forums. Don't be surprised to find us walking your neighborhoods, outside your courthouse, or at your polling place on Election Day. While doing your research, be sure to review the Channel 13 Investigates and the Inside Edition segments on the Alissa Guernsey case. Wible refuses to be accessible to the media, acting like a scared rabbit as reporters try to question him. His behavior is unacceptable for an elected public official in a country that guarantees freedom of the press. Wible was voted out of office last time he ran for prosecutor. You've done your civic duty. Let's leave it that way. Marshall D. Talbert. For much longer than Alyssa's not quite 17 months on this earth, her story has been raising awareness of the issues of child abuse, judicial misconduct, and corruption in the justice system. 3 issues about which I feel incredibly strongly. And that's why I'm doing this podcast right now, and why I write Suffer the Little Children blog. Alyssa's short life has had an immeasurable impact on thousands of others. Whether we will ever see true justice for Alissa seems unlikely, but at the very least, we must never forget Alissa Beth Guernsey, baby dragonfly, the tiny, blonde-haired, brown-eyed girl with the big, bright smile. Think of Alissa every time you see a dragonfly, and share her story with everyone you can. Alissa deserves to be remembered. I'm your host, Lane, and this is episode 25, Alissa Guernsey Revisited. I initially covered Alyssa's case on sufferthelittlechildrenblog.com as well as on episode 8 of this podcast. I've been aware of Alissa's story for many years, and as I mentioned in the initial episode, she was one of the kids whose stories led me down this path and ultimately prompted the creation of my blog and the podcast. You may want to go back and listen to episode 8 to get the full scope of Alissa's abuse, death, and legal case, the injustice of the sentence given to her killer, and the controversy that has since surrounded Alissa's story. Many suspected some professional or personal relationship between the judge and Christy's father, Kerry Sprunger, a prominent businessman in LaGrange County, may have led to Christy's absurdly light sentence. Many have also blamed Prosecutor Wible for not filing stiffer charges against Christy in the first place. Protests have been held, rallies have been organized, and marches have taken place, but it is highly unlikely Christy could ever face additional charges. Other than brief remarks to the reporters covering Alissa's case for Inside Edition and 13 Investigates several years ago, former prosecutor Jeff Wible has never given an interview about Alissa's case, which has haunted him over the past 11 years. I reached out to Mr. Wible a couple of months ago, asking if he might consider doing an interview about Alissa's case and giving his side of the story of prosecuting Christy Shaffer. I was flattered that he got back to me very quickly and ultimately agreed to talk to me on the podcast about the case. Today, for the first time, you're going to hear the prosecutor from Alissa Guernsey's case answer questions I know a lot of us have had for many years. Without further ado, here's my telephone interview from August 4th, 2020, with Mr. Jeff Wible. I have with me today a very special guest. I have Mr. Jeff Wible from Indiana, who was the prosecutor on the Alissa Guernsey case. Hi, Mr. Wible.
Lane, thank you for having me. It's good to talk to you.
Thank you. You too. I appreciate you participating in the interview. Can you give us some background on your career, like where you started and some of the positions you've had?
Sure. Lane, I've practiced law for a little over 28 years, approaching 29 years in the state of Indiana. I started as a deputy prosecutor in the early 90s in LaGrange County. In 2002, I was elected prosecutor to 3 terms. I got to serve a little bit more than 3 terms because my predecessor left office early. After those 3+ terms, I was a deputy prosecutor in Noble County for 4 years and 4 months. All along since the early 90s, I've maintained my own private practice. I normally do estate work and business planning, litigation, and I do some misdemeanor criminal defense and personal injury work.
And have you ever prosecuted a case that you would consider as complicated or controversial as Alissa's case?
I don't know that Alissa Guernsey's case was necessarily complicated. In terms of it being controversial, I think it's been the most controversial lawsuit I've ever been involved with in 28 years of practicing law.
As we all know, Christy Shaffer, who was the suspect in Alissa's death, was convicted of child neglect with bodily injury. And I know that's a big part of the controversy. Would you say this case has followed you throughout your professional career since it happened?
I'd say it's followed me somewhat, but I think I don't know that it was necessarily the original decision that was controversial. My suspicion is, and of course I don't take a poll, but my suspicion is what really made it controversial was the judge's decision to modify the sentence 70 or 80 days after the original sentence. I think that's, in my opinion, that's what made it controversial.
Right, sure. That definitely got people out and protesting. I know that was probably why Inside Edition and 13 Investigates had a lot of things to say about the case. Do you think that the case and its outcome had anything to do with the way your recent Senate run went?
I suspect, and I don't take a poll, Wayne, but I suspect there are people who may have voted for me that at the end of the day did not vote for me, but I do not believe that it came close to affecting the result.
Okay. That's fair. Now, as far as back when the charges were actually filed against Christy, what factors prompted you to convene a grand jury, which you had said you had never done before?
Right. I did convene a grand jury. So Alissa died, and understand, Lane, this is going on 11 and a half years ago, so I might not get dates exactly right. Alissa Guernsey died the last weekend in March of 2009, if my memory is correct. And I think it was a weekend. When I got to work the following Monday morning, shortly after 8 o'clock, I had a call from a detective, and I probably had a 15 or 20-minute conversation with the detective, and I knew at that point in time I would be calling a grand jury. And the reason why I knew I would be calling a grand jury is because I knew after speaking with the detective for 15 or 20 minutes that I couldn't be confident about who was responsible for Alissa Guernsey's death.
Okay. Was it because there were more than one adult in the home?
Well, here's what it amounts to, or just a little bit of background, if folks don't know it. Christy Shaffer and her husband were foster parents to a number of little children. I want to say, including Alissa Guernsey, it was 4 or 5. It might have been more, but I'm not certain. The problem I had is that, as I say, I couldn't tell who it was that actually did the damage or injury to Alissa Guernsey. And by way of example, I know that Christy Shaffer's husband was in the home at approximately the time that the blow that was struck against Alissa Guernsey was struck, because I deposed him. So I know that he was there. You see, during the course of the proceedings, I believe that what we established was that the blow that caused Alissa's death likely took place 2.5 to 3 hours prior to the time that she actually expired. And so when I deposed Christy Shaffer's husband, there was no doubt that he was there. Okay. Now, obviously he didn't say I did it. He obviously didn't say that his wife did it. But the other problem, and this was perhaps at least as big as the problem with her husband, is that there were foster children in that home, and of course foster children have parents. And there was no way that we could exclude either any of the foster parents or anybody else that may have been in that community at the time it happened. I mean, we obviously don't know exactly when or exactly how it occurred, but there were several people that we could not exclude for having done it. And given the fact that nobody saw Christy Shaffer do it, Christy Shaffer never implicated herself. We had no DNA. We had no fingerprints. We had no weapon that could have been used with DNA or fingerprints on it. There wasn't anything in the home that would have indicated that Alissa Guernsey was flung into a hard object like a wall or a door. So we just didn't have those pieces of the puzzle. And so, I mean, that's really the central problem with the whole case is that I couldn't say for certain who did it. And of course, the rest is history, but I just couldn't say that Christy Shaffer or any other person for that matter did it.
Were the other children who were in the van that day deposed, or were they able to be deposed?
Well, the children were not deposed in the sense that they were brought in for a formal deposition and placed under oath. And the reason why they weren't is because they were too young. Now, I do know that one of the children, and it would have been a very small child, and my recollection is she was probably in the nature of 3 years old. she gave a statement to a detective. But at 3 years of age or less, you don't put a 3-year-old child under oath. At least I don't know of anybody else that's done it.
Sure, of course, yeah.
So.
Okay, yeah, I was curious about Alyssa's older sister. I think she was 6. I know she was the one who had later told her mother what she had seen, but I don't know if that was something she had mentioned at the beginning or not.
Well, and what I'm not sure of, Lane, is, and this is it's possibly true, but I don't know that Alissa Guernsey's older sister, was there. I'm not saying she wasn't, but I don't recall that Alissa Guernsey had another full-blooded sibling that was living in the Shaffer home, if that makes sense to you.
Right. No, I think she was a half-sister. She and Alyssa's older brother were there.
And that may have been.
Okay. Do you think now, based on the autopsy that was performed and those post-mortem photos that a lot of us have seen that show Alyssa's injuries, that neglect resulting in injury was the only charge that could have been laid against Christy?
Well, Lane, the question that you originally posed, was it the only prosecutable charge? And so I would answer the question this way. You can file any charge you want, but I think you also have to say to yourself, especially if you're the prosecutor, what are my chances of sustaining a conviction? You see what I'm saying? So let me answer your question this way. I think the charge of neglect of a dependent as a Class B felony was the highest crime that we were likely to get a conviction to. And the reason why, and I think I spoke to this earlier, the reason why you weren't going to get a murder conviction or a manslaughter conviction is because you couldn't tell who did it. And so, see, in the state of Indiana, murder is its own level of crime. Manslaughter is a Class A felony, and neglect of a dependent is a Class B felony. So I think the answer to your question is that a Class B felony, under the circumstances and under the facts, was the highest crime that we were likely to get a conviction to. And so that's why I pursued it.
Was there any particular reason that you chose neglect resulting in injury rather than neglect resulting in death?
Well, and that's a good question. Neglect resulting in death at the time in Indiana was a Class A felony. Okay, and I mean, the problem is that if you're going to charge her with a Class A felony, neglect of a dependent, I think you might as well charge her with manslaughter as a Class A felony. And I did not think, you see, I think what got her indicted, and you know, I can't see in the minds of the grand jurors, but I think what got her indicted was testimony that Alissa Guernsey was obviously laboring and struggling while she was under the supervision of Christy Shaffer, and that as a responsible adult, Christy Shaffer should have recognized that. And so if you boil it all the way down, I think that, I mean, it's my opinion that that's the fact that got her indicted, and of course that indictment led to the B felony conviction.
Okay, but that documentation is permanently sealed, right?
I don't know where it's permanently sealed or not. So the grand jury proceeding took place in the spring and summer of 2009, and I was in office for another 5 years. And so, I mean, you know, as the prosecutor, there was no need for me to try to unseal the documentation because I was the prosecutor. And now, whether the law in the state of Indiana allows that or not, I simply do not know.
Now, as far as the grand jury, I'm not sure how that whole proceeding works, but if you had seen fit, could you have pressed additional charges beyond those that the grand jury chose to indict if you had thought it was appropriate?
Yes, I could have. But if I was going to do that, then I would have filed those charges on my own to begin with instead of petitioning the court to assemble a grand jury.
All right. And as far as that grand jury went, what evidence did you present to them?
Everything I had. I would say that the highlights of the grand jury. See, the grand jury actually took place on 2 different days. And the reason why it took place on 2 different days is because we couldn't get 2 doctors in the same place at the same time. I mean, I think it would have been easier for the grand jury to understand the evidence if they got to listen to both of the doctors back to back. But the doctors' schedules just would not permit it. There was at least one other police officer that testified. I don't think any of the children testified, and as I indicated earlier, I just don't know that when you have 2, 3, and 4-year-old kids that their memory is going to be that good and that they're going to be that reliable. And we also submitted to the grand jury photographs of Alissa's body after she died. So the grand jury saw are what I would refer to as fairly gruesome photographs. The grand jury clearly saw those photographs.
And do you agree with the coroner's ruling of homicide in the case?
Well, here's what I would say. I'm not a doctor, but based on the photographs that I saw, I don't know how it could be. I understand why the doctor said homicide. I mean, it quite arguably was, but before you convict somebody of homicide, you got to have a defendant that you can connect the evidence to. And again, that was the big problem with the case.
Do you have any personal or professional knowledge of the Sprunger family or any relationship with them at all?
I didn't know Christy Shaffer before this. I didn't know Christy Shaffer's mother. I knew who her father was because he was an officer at a local bank. Now that said, he's not a client of mine. I mean, if I walked into the lobby of the bank, I would know him well enough to say hello, and I'm sure that on a number of occasions I did, at least up until the time this happened, and then, after his daughter was indicted, he didn't want to talk to me anymore, which is understandable.
What about Judge Vanderbeck? Did he have any type of relationship with the family?
Well, during the course of Christy Shaffer's sentencing, the judge indicated that he did know Christy Shaffer's father. Whether Christy Shaffer's father was a client of his from before he was on the bench, I just don't know. I obviously don't monitor people's personal relationships, but it was clear that the judge knew her father. I don't have any reason to believe that the judge knew Christy Shaffer.
Do you think that his knowledge of the family or any relationship he might have had would have affected his ability to be objective?
I don't know. I would like to think not. Again, I can't see in between somebody's ears, but there's nothing. This is my subjective belief. I think this case troubled Judge Vanderbeck for a long, long time. And I've known him since I've known Judge Vanderbeck for approximately 30 years, and he is as decent and kind and conscientious of a man as you will ever meet. But being in the position that he's in as a judge, and he was a judge for 20 some odd years. You're going to have cases that trouble you and that you make decisions on, and they may be cases that you wish that you can take back and do differently. But once the decision's made, it's made.
Were you pressured by anyone to kind of go easy on Christy?
Absolutely not. The case was controversial, and I know that. Christy was from the town of Topeka, and at the time I had spoke to the former town marshal of Topeka, and I knew him relatively well, And I asked him, what the public sentiment was within the town of Topeka, and he said the public sentiment was split right down the middle in terms of either being in support of her or not being in support of her. But, to answer your narrow question, nobody ever asked me to do that.
Okay. And as far as Christy's plea agreement, can you explain how that came about and what it entailed?
Well, yeah. In fact, there was no plea agreement. She would not accept the plea agreement that I offered. Okay, so what you have to understand, at the time, this was a Class B felony in the state of Indiana. And so the maximum penalty on a Class B felony was 20 years in prison unless you had no criminal record. And Christy Shaffer, in fact, had no criminal record, at least up to that time. She didn't even have a speeding ticket. So because of her lacking, non-existent criminal record, the maximum sentence under Indiana law at that time was 10 years. And so the plea agreement that I offered was 10 years. In retrospect, it may have been a mistake to offer her a plea agreement to the maximum. And the reason why I say that is because she had nothing to lose by pleading to the court. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Okay, so by just offering her guilty plea directly to the court, she kind of circumvented that agreement.
Yeah, I mean, there literally was no plea agreement that she signed. She threw herself at the mercy of the court. And I mean, arguably what I should have done is I should have made the plea agreement for 9 years, because then if she pled to the court and the judge gave her 10, she would have had something to lose. So I think the point is there was no plea agreement. And so she pled to the court and sought the court's mercy. She didn't get it immediately, but she eventually got it.
That is for certain. I know you had opposed that, the shortening of her sentence, and that was definitely in the media. I know I have your quote saying so in the podcast episode. Now, over the years, a lot of people have participated in rallies and protests looking for justice for Alissa, wanting further charges pressed against Christy and so on. But did Christy's guilty plea to that particular charge prevent any future prosecution of Christy on any other charges in Alissa's death?
In my opinion, double jeopardy principles would prohibit the prosecution of Christy Shaffer for anything that occurred during what I believe was the last weekend in March of 2009. I think that the double jeopardy provisions of the U.S. Constitution and Indiana Constitution would prohibit a prosecution of Christy Shaffer. So I think the answer to your question is yes, and the reason why I'm a little bit wordy about it is because if there was anybody else involved in it, and the charge was, for instance, murder, then there's no statute of limitations on that.
Okay, but not for Christy herself. If there was someone else involved, that was another story.
Exactly. For Christy Shaffer is, in my legal opinion, done with respect to this transaction. She was not done after her sentence was modified. I prosecuted her again, but those were for completely different and unrelated charges.
That was the drug arrest.
Correct.
Okay.
That happened after her sentence was modified for the charges related to Alissa Guernsey. She got in trouble, I want to say, for possession of methamphetamine. So I did prosecute her for that, and her probation was violated on the charge that related to Alissa Guernsey's death.
And that's why she ended up serving the remainder of the sentence.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, as far as Christy goes, personally, do you feel she was responsible for Alyssa's death?
I don't know. I don't know, and I you know, from time to time, Lane, I ask myself that question, and you know, I was the prosecutor for a very long time, and so when you're in that position, you're at the confluence of everybody's dirty laundry in a relatively small community, and I know that, you know, whenever I filed a charge against somebody or decided not to file a charge against somebody, the question in the test was always the same, and that is, can I sleep at night? To this day, I'm not convinced that Christy Shaffer committed a homicidal act. And now, when I say a homicidal act, what I mean is an act of murder or an act of manslaughter. Okay. She had no criminal record prior to March of 2009. She had no record of violence. And I couldn't rule out the other people in the home. And I knew beyond any doubt that her husband was there. And I don't know whether you've seen the photographs of Alissa or not, but, you know, it would be easier for a man to create that kind of damage than a woman, assuming that physically the man is stronger than the woman. And in this case, that would have been true. You know, that's a fair question for you to ask. I can't, as I sit here this moment, pin a homicidal act on Christy Shaffer because of Alissa Guernsey's death.
Okay. In that case, do you feel that Christy received a severe enough punishment to make up for the loss of Alyssa's life?
No, she did not. No. And here's the reason why I say that. Let's assume it was different circumstances. Let's say that the crime that Christy Shaffer was charged with was operating while intoxicated, resulting in death. Okay, and so it was a car accident, and Alissa Guernsey died as a result of the car accident. Surely Christy Shaffer would have spent more than 70 or 80 days in jail for that, even though it was her first criminal conviction. And maybe that's not the best example, but do you see what I'm saying?
Yes, yep, other circumstances would have made the sentence more severe.
She was convicted of a Class B felony, which is just 2 rungs lower than the most serious crime in Indiana, and that's worth more than 70 or 80 days in jail, in my opinion.
Why do you think Judge Vanderbeck was as willing as he was to modify Christy's sentence and just release her on the spot after 77 days?
Well, you know, and that's an excellent question. And I think maybe in part, I answered that earlier. Scott Vanderbeck is one of the most decent people you'll ever meet. It could be one of 2 things. Number one, it could be that he just simply made a mistake. And if he did it, you know, it was a whopper, but he made a mistake. The other thing could have been is that he just simply felt as though that the original sentence of 6 years was too harsh. Now, I don't think it was myself, but the legislature gave him the option of doing what he did, and obviously he took it to the fullest extent.
Well, a lot of people kind of throw the phrase small town politics around about the handling of Alyssa's case. Would you agree with that assessment as far as Topeka and LaGrange County?
Well, when you use the phrase, Lane, small town politics, I'm not sure what you mean. Could you be a little more specific on that?
Yeah, I know that was definitely mentioned by a number of people. It's been a phrase that's been thrown around, but I think what they mean is somebody knew somebody who knew somebody. It was
okay. So, and I guess that goes back to the relationship between Judge Vanderbeck and Christy Shaffer's family, if Judge Vanderbeck felt that he could not objectively preside over the case, then he should have recused himself. He did recuse himself for the second case, but I have to wonder if that was just not to avoid the controversy. I mean, that is, so going in, he must have felt that he could have acted objectively. And whether he did or not, maybe he miscalculated. All I can do is hypothesize about what he's thinking. If you go back to the phrase small town politics, I kind of draw that to his relationship with her father. If he felt that was going to prejudice him, then he should have recused himself at the outset instead of presiding over the entire matter.
Right. I think that's an opinion that's pretty widely held, I believe.
I'm sure.
As far as the news coverage that has come out on Alissa's case, I know it was a few years ago, but the Inside Edition piece and the 13 Investigates both did television pieces about it. Do you feel like that's been fair and truthful, or were some facts misrepresented?
I don't know, because I don't know what they said. I would imagine, Lane, that the coverage that was given the case that you're speaking of was 9 or 10 years ago. And so I just don't have any recollection of what the coverage was. And I guess, part of the reason why we're having this dialogue and I'm answering these questions is just to give everybody some insight about what was going through my mind at the time and why I made the decisions that I did. So I can't, not knowing what they said, I can't say whether they misrepresented it or not.
It's been a conception in the case that you don't want to talk to anyone or you refuse to speak with media regarding the case. But do you want to clear that up?
Yeah. There's only one person that's wanted to talk to me about the case that I refused to talk to. And I think I knew who he was. And I guess the only reason why I didn't want to talk to him is because I think he's known as a sensationalist, and I just didn't see anything productive coming of it. So I just never bothered to return his call. Any other journalist or any other person that's wanted to talk about the case, I've talked to him about it. So to the degree that there's a perception that I didn't want to talk about it, the perception is incorrect.
Okay. Thank you for clearing that up. If you could start at the very beginning of the case again and prosecute it over again, would you change anything that you did?
And I think I alluded to that earlier. So when, after the grand jury issued its indictments, and we got to the point where there was going to be a plea, the maximum she could have got under Indiana law at the time was 10 years. And I guess I felt like, this was, despite the fact that she didn't have a prior criminal record, this was just one case where I didn't want to offer any less than the maximum. Now, in retrospect, that may have been a mistake, because when she opted to deny the plea agreement and plead to the court, she was essentially bargaining with the court and not me. I mean, the judge would have let me argue until I was blue in the face, but, when she pled to the court, the plea agreement's off the table. And that is part of what made her sentence modification possible, because in Indiana, a plea agreement is viewed like a contract, and both sides are bound by it unless both sides want to change it. Well, so there was no contract, and her agreement was with the court. And so that allowed her to come back a couple months later and say, how about a modification? And so if your question is, would I do something differently? In retrospect, instead of offering a plea agreement that was for 10 years, perhaps I should have offered one that was for 9 years, because then she would have had some risk, because obviously her attorney would have said to her, look, you can take 9 years and it's done and over with, or you can risk it and get 10. Was that possibly a mistake? It possibly was, but, and I thought about this question because, we've had this conversation. I just felt, under the circumstances of, that case, offering a plea to the maximum was the most just thing, that I could do. And so that's what I did. And so I don't know that I would change that today if it happened again. But that's the closest thing to doing something different that I might have done.
All right. And to wrap things up, is there any statement you'd like to make to the public in regard to Alissa Guernsey or the case, or is there anything that you'd like to say or to clear up?
I feel horrible that she died. She was a charming little girl, and from other pictures that I could see of her. But when you're the prosecutor, you bear a heavy burden, and your obligation is always to do what is just within your power. Had I been able to get Lane the 9 or 10 year sentence that I originally sought out to get, I think justice would have been done under these facts. And I'm sorry that it didn't happen. Perhaps I should have raised more hell with the judge. Perhaps I should have done that. But the problem is that, it's easy for a person who doesn't practice law to berate a judge. As an attorney, you're obviously not allowed to do that. That's what causes you to get disbarred or thrown in jail. And so, I am sorry it turned out the way it did, but at the end of the day, the judge decided that he was going to let her out, and his decision was made over my objection. And even though I didn't like the decision, I have to be respectful to a judge, because as an attorney, if you're in court any amount of time, judges make decisions you don't like all the time. That doesn't mean that you are disrespectful to them. That's how civilized society breaks down. I wish it would have turned out differently, but it didn't. And I think at every turn I made the best legal decision that could have been made at the time with the facts.
That's fair. I really appreciate that answer. And I want to thank you again for agreeing to do this interview and for clearing up a lot of questions that I think a lot of people have had over the years in regard to Alissa's case. It has definitely touched a nerve with a lot of people, and there's a lot of people out there who didn't know her in life, including myself, but will certainly never forget Alissa.
I understand, and I appreciate the chance to talk to you.
A huge thank you to Jeff Wible for agreeing to do a recorded interview on this podcast. During our interview, I forgot to ask Mr. Wible one of the most enduring and important questions, and that is, why was Matt Shaffer, Christy's husband, given immunity? Mr. Wible called me on Monday morning to provide me with an answer to that question. He said that since Alissa's death occurred 11 years ago, some of the details are hard to remember, but he does not remember offering Matt immunity. He said that immunity was not the concern of Matt's attorney, but rather the attorney was concerned about spousal privilege, which means that a person cannot be compelled to testify against his own spouse. However, Mr. Wible explained that in Indiana, when it comes to a charge like the one Christy faced, at least at the time, there was no right of spousal privilege, so Matt would have been compelled to testify had Christy's case gone to trial. Mr. Wible said in his interview that he did depose Matt Shaffer himself, but Matt did not implicate either his wife or himself during his deposition. Anyway, I'm interested to hear what you guys think of what he had to say. Please weigh in with your opinions, thoughts, and comments on the podcast's Facebook page at facebook.com/sufferthelittlechildrenpod. That's it for this week, guys. Join me next week for another case. If you like the show, please follow or subscribe to Suffer the Little Children on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, Spreaker, Pandora, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast listening app. And please leave me a 5-star rating and a positive review on your favorite podcast platform. Visit the website at sufferthelittlechildrenpod.com, where you can listen to episodes or become a patron for rewards ranging from a shout-out by name on the show to bonus content and exclusive gifts. Follow the podcast on Facebook, Instagram, Tumblr, and Pinterest at Suffer the Little Children Pod, and on Twitter and TikTok at STLCpod. View photos related to today's episode on Facebook and Instagram. For more stories like the one you heard today, visit sufferthelittlechildrenblog.com. This podcast is researched, written, hosted, edited, and produced by Lane. All music for the show is licensed from audiojungle.net. Email tips, comments, questions, or case suggestions to sufferthelittlechildren.pod@gmail.com. For more information about preventing or reporting child abuse, visit childhelp.org or call your area's child abuse hotline. If you see something, say something. Until next week, bye everyone.